If we haven't met, welcome to S3, Salem Signing Service. Whitney and I are co-pastors here. If you're new, welcome. We're glad to see you here. If you've been coming for a long time, we're not glad to see you. No, just kidding. We're always glad to see you too. So today we're continuing our series about connecting the dots. It's a 6-part series, and today we're on part 4. Our main topic today is here. You can see it on the screen. Self-destruction. Now wait a second. That should be flipped. Sorry about that. I think I typed it wrong. It should say self-obsession leads to self-destruction. You're glad you came today, right? Good topic to study. Self-obsession leads to self-destruction. Such a comfortable one. We're focused on the book of Esther. Today we'll be talking about chapter 5, verse 9, through chapter 6, verse 14. So remember, in the book of Esther, God is working behind the scenes. He's not explicitly named in that book at all. So God's name is mentioned throughout the Bible, but it doesn't appear in the book of Esther. We just see God working behind the scenes in everything that occurs. So let's review a little bit about what we've been talking about so far. First, let's watch this passage in ASL. Let me summarize what happens in this passage. So we take it's a little bit of a subplot. So we had seen that Esther had invited the king and Haman to come to a banquet together, and the king asked Esther, "What would you like?" "Up to half my kingdom." And Esther said, "I'd like you to come to another banquet tomorrow." The king agreed, with Haman as well. And so now we're between the first banquet and the second banquet. That's where this passage happens. So what happens is Haman goes back home after that first banquet, and he's riding pretty high, right? Because he was just invited to this really fancy banquet with only the king and queen, so it was a huge honor. But it just so happens, as Haman's leaving, he sees Mordecai. And instantly, he's enraged. Because Mordecai is, out doing his thing. And he doesn't stop what he's doing to honor Haman as Haman walks by. He just goes on with his life. And Haman is enraged that Mordecai doesn't honor him, doesn't give him his recognition. So he doesn't do anything at that point. He goes home, but he's pretty furious. He calls his whole family and everyone together, and he's telling them all about, I was invited to the banquet with the king and queen, and it was such an honor. I'm second in command in the whole kingdom. And he's just bragging to all of his people. So he's listing all of these accomplishments and successes, and he says, but all of this, I can't be happy because of Mordecai. So his wife and his friends say, hey, why don't you build a 75-foot pole, and hang Mordecai on it, and kill him. That's pretty, So let's take a minute and think about 75 feet tall. That's about 12 stories. Think of a 12-story building. Think about how tall that is. 75-foot pole, that's really tall. I don't even know where he would get that pole. So back to the story. So Haman talks with his family and friends, and then he goes, that's going on one side of town. Meanwhile, the king can't sleep that night. And he's tossing and turning, and he calls for the chronicles of his reign to be read to him. And this one story comes up. That story is about Mordecai What had happened was Mordecai found out about an assassination plot that these two men were planning to kill a king. And so Mordecai reported to the king, and the king was saved. And then in this book, the king is hearing this story read, and he says, what happened? And those two men were caught and executed. He says, what was done for the man who reported the assassination plot? And the servants tell him nothing. So he's kind of thinking about that. And while he's thinking about that, Haman comes walking into the palace. Haman is showing up to the palace because he wants to ask the king's permission to kill Mordecai on this 75-foot pole that he's erected. So at the same time that Haman's coming in to ask for permission to execute Mordecai, the king is thinking about this situation where Mordecai had saved the king's life. So Haman walks up, and before he can say anything, the king says, hey, Haman, what would the king like to do? What should the king do to honor someone that has served the king well? And Haman's like, oh, he must be talking about me, surely, right? So Haman's like, oh, what you should do is take a robe that the king has worn and put it on that man. And take a horse that the king has ridden and put that man on the horse. And let that horse have the seal of the king, the royal seal, on the horse. They had this head decoration for the horse. And Haman said, let that man be on the horse with his robe and be taken through town and proclaimed as this is what is done for someone who the king wishes to honor. And Haman's all, excited about this. And then the king says, everything that you've just said, let it be done for Mordecai. Can you imagine Haman thinking, oh, I thought all this was going to be done for me, but in fact, I have to do it for Mordecai. So sure enough, Haman takes Mordecai out, gives him the king's robe and the king's horse, and rides him through town, saying, this is what shall be done for a man the king wishes to honor. If you like irony like I do, you'll really appreciate that part of the story. So Haman finishes with that and is, understandably upset. He goes back home, tells his family and friends what just happened. And they said, wow, you are trying to get rid of Mordecai. You are trying to take revenge on him for not recognizing you. You better stop because it's not working. If you continue to try and come against him, you're going to lose everything. Well, at that time, the king's servant came and called Haman to go to the next banquet. So there we are in chapter 6, verse 14. You want to know what happens after that? Come next week. Okay, so let's take a minute and review everything that's happened so far. I'm not going to go into every detail because it's quite a long list. But let's look at a few of the steps. Let me throw out some of the key events. So one of the most important steps was that Esther became queen. And then you see right below that one, it says Mordecai is promoted to palace official and discovered the assassination plot. That's really important. And the third one here, we find out that Xerxes' treasure is empty and Haman gets promoted. An edict is passed to kill the Jews. That's an important one. Esther goes to the king, trying to remove that law. But if Esther goes to the king without being summoned, she could be executed. Then the king extends his scepter and saves her life. Esther requests him to come to the first banquet. And she hadn't yet mentioned that edict, that law. So now, from chapter 5 through 6 that we just talked about, we see all of these events happening. There's quite a bit. So you see Haman runs into Mordecai. Haman kind of starts falling apart. The king hears a bedtime story about Mordecai, who reported the assassination plot. And then it just so happened that Haman came back to the king right when the king was wondering about how to honor Mordecai. When he was asked about how to honor a man that the king wanted to honor, Haman was blind to the fact that it couldn't possibly be anyone else than him. So he had this whole plan, and then the king had him do that for Mordecai. So you can see how all of these steps are coming together through the book of Esther, connecting the dots. So think about this. Haman was already second in command. He had all of these riches, all of these possessions. He had kids, he had family, he had it seems like he had everything. But he wasn't happy because of this one little thing, just seeing Mordecai. Why didn't he just blow that off, right? Let's take a look more at Haman. We want to look at Haman and his reaction because we can see that in ourselves as well. There are times in my life where I can really see a lot of similarities between him and myself. Haman missed the dots being connected, right? When the king asked him, how should I honor a man? It did not even occur to Haman that it could be someone else. He didn't even pause to think about that. His pride made him just assume that it had to be himself. And that sometimes pride is really obvious, but sometimes it's not. Pride comes from sin. And we know there's arrogance, that's one kind of pride. But there are other types as well, right? So this idea of saying like, oh, I'm not important, I'm nothing, I'm worthless, self-depreciation. That's another kind of pride. A lot of people think that that's humility. Oh, it's not me, I'm not important, I can't, I'm not worth anything. So be careful about that because people will praise that as humility, but it really can be a signifier of hidden pride. If someone praises you, rather than self-depreciating, you can just say thank you. It's a nice word. Just say thank you. Here are some symptoms of self-obsession. It's not just these three, but these are a few examples. We'll focus on these three today. Fragile happiness, anger, and picture like a drinking fountain. It's this idea of drinking from a fountain that never satisfies. So it's continually needing more and never being satisfied. Let's start with fragile happiness. This is a little hard to see. But obviously you can see in the middle that yellow smiley face is representing happiness. And all around it are things that can lead to happiness. And so the point is that there are a lot of things in life that can impact our happiness. So let's see, for example, the birth of your first child can make you happy, absolutely. Or getting a job promotion, and vice versa. If you find out that your colleague was promoted and you weren't, that can impact your happiness potentially, as an example. So life events can impact our happiness. We can be happy one moment and depressed the next if everything is relying on events. If our happiness solely depends on what happens moment to moment. And we see that in Haman. He just went to this banquet with the king and queen, the first banquet, and he was very happy because he was recognized as important. But like a light switch, the moment he saw Mordecai, the happiness was gone out the window, and he was enraged. So it makes me think, gosh, am I ever like that? Totally, right? So sometimes, like, I finish my day at work at OSD and I'm pretty happy, and I drive home, and I'm on my way home. I'm so happy to be going home, and a train blocks me, right? We've got those train tracks right over by OSD. And sometimes I'm sitting in my car, and it's one of those really long trains with all the logging on it, and I know it's going to be a 5-minute wait, and I'm sitting in my car, and sure enough, my happiness just can dissipate, right? So I finally, the train goes by and I arrive home, and 5 minutes really is nothing in the long scheme of things, but even just a 5-minute train wait can impact my happiness. Or, Whitney will tell you, my wife will tell you, I really get impacted by bad drivers. It really gets to me, and I know it, but someone cuts me off and my happiness is gone. I'm like, why don't they use their blinker? Why did they cut me off? Why didn't they use their mirrors? And Whitney's like, calm down, it's not a big deal, it's fine. They just moved in front of you, we didn't crash, it's fine. And I'm like, but they should have followed the rules, they should have used their blinker, I don't know why it's so frustrating to me, but that's an example of how you can see my happiness is being so impacted by the smallest things. And if someone cuts me off, I will take the rest of the drive home. I'll be thinking about that driver and just mad about that driver. And I'm learning to let that go. I'm sure all of you can think of examples like that in your life too, where you can be flying high and then the smallest thing happens and just that happiness turns into anger in a flash, right? Or maybe you're different than me, but it's very common. So now anger, that character from that movie Inside Out. I love that movie. It's a really good movie. This is anger. And it's very clear in Haman that he's got quite a temper. And he's so angry, he built that 75-foot pole. I mean, that's a little extreme, right? Why not an 8-foot pole? That would be sufficient, right? If you threw someone on a 8-foot pole, they would die, right? If you staked them with this 8-foot pole, that would be plenty, but he built a 75-foot pole. That really says something. Oftentimes our anger gets out of whack. Right? It's way more extreme than necessary. Anger, though, often is not actually the first emotion that we have. Anger is often hiding something else behind it, right? Feeling helpless, feeling out of control, feeling sad, feeling frustrated, feeling afraid. All of these different emotions can be the first emotion we feel, and then quickly anger covers it up. But the anger is not ever the real root emotion. It's another emotion that leads to anger. So Haman obviously has pride issues. His anger is coming from the fact that Mordecai didn't acknowledge him, didn't recognize him as important. And he felt embarrassed, or maybe he, felt like that embarrassment, then it got covered up by anger. In Ephesians 4:26 to 32, I'm going to summarize that here. It says, don't sin by allowing anger to control you. Get rid of bitterness, anger, worrying, fighting, criticism, and all these other types of malice. These verses are encouraging us to separate ourselves from those kinds of anger. But we can see that Haman certainly was letting anger control him. So I have a question for you. We just read verses about anger and everything, and we see anger in Haman. Is it okay ever to be angry? You're all so quiet. Feels like a trick question, huh? You're saying it depends. What do you think? It is okay to be angry without sinning. You say no, never. You can never be angry. Okay. Let me give you this answer. What do you think back there? Anger is okay if you have a good reason. Okay. You can get frustrated, and that can become anger. Kids. Kids can make us angry. Yep. Kids peeing on the floor. Yep. That would make me mad. Last one. From work. Frustrations at work. Yep. Absolutely. Or your boss yelling at you can make you angry. Holy anger, righteous anger. Yeah. Okay. So the answer is yes. It is okay to be angry. Let me see on the screen here. Anger is one of many emotions we feel. It's natural and it's okay. It's the behavior we choose when we're angry that we need to be careful about. So, for example, yelling at someone or hitting someone is not okay, right? If we feel that anger, we take a minute, pray, spend some time with God, hit a pillow maybe, whatever you need to do, whatever your way is of getting that anger out. There's different ways. I usually walk it off. If I'm very angry, I need to go for a walk to kind of give that anger some time to release a bit and spend some time with God. And then I can address things. So whatever you need to do to kind of let some of that anger out and then deal with it. So before we move on to the third one, Haman obviously did not choose the right behavior when he was feeling anger. Right? He got mad, and then he decided to kill Mordecai and built this 75-foot pole, and he decided to kill all of the Jews. I mean, that's a very extreme response. So that was what he did with his anger. Now going on to the third point that we want to talk about today is drinking from a fountain that never satisfies. Obviously, Haman wanted recognition. He wanted power. He wanted wealth. He wanted everyone to see that he was important, see that he was a somebody. And he was bragging to all of his family about all of those things that he thought made him important. But we know there's always going to be someone who has more money, or is more attractive, is, a better athlete than me, is smarter than me. There will always be someone better than. If we're bragging about our intellect or our wealth or our athletic prowess or whatever, it's never going to satisfy because there's always going to be someone else. If we're relying on things to satisfy us, they never truly make us feel whole. Haman was chasing after all of those things. And we can see that they never satisfied. He had all of these things in his life that he could brag about. And I kind of look at his story and think, gosh, I would be so happy if I had all those things, right? But then I have to pause and think, would I really be? He wasn't. And just things like wealth or having more kids or having whatever it is. This idea that once I have this, then I'll be satisfied. But it's a bit like drinking from the ocean, right? If you drink from the ocean, you'll just be more thirsty. Here's an example. So, Haman, for example, was clearly not drinking from God, right? He was trying to be satisfied by all of these other things. He had completely blown God off. So here's another question for you. Let's say you're walking down the street in Portland and you see a water fountain. Would you drink from that in Portland? Why not? Might be dirty. Not sure if it's clean water. Has it been run through a filter? Could have diseases in it. What about water from the mountain? If there was a drinking fountain up in the mountain somewhere? Clean water? Okay. So it's something to think about. We consider the source of where that water is coming from. And that's a bit like life as well. We have to think about, where's the source of this coming from? Is it a healthy source? If we think, oh, I'm getting promoted in my job, that's making me feel good, but where's the source coming from? Where's the source of my happiness? Or where's my healing coming from? Where's my wholeness coming from? And other people may say it's perfectly okay to feel fulfilled by being promoted, but we always want to come back to, where's the source? In John, the Gospel of John tells us Jesus is the living water. He says, if you drink from this fountain, you'll never be thirsty again. So we always come back to Jesus as the living water, as the true source of life. And we know that that source is pure and good. So Haman had everything, yet he was never satisfied because he was drinking from the wrong source. So we've covered this. So this is a caution for all of us, myself included. Self-obsession blinds us from being able to connect the dots. It's so easy to overlook what God is doing behind the scenes. Everything that happens, we are just sometimes going along in our own life, thinking about other things, not thinking about God's ways. I love Jordana's song that she led us in worship with. Oftentimes, she often leads us in the song that says, your will, your ways, your will, your ways. Everything coming back to what God is doing. In Proverbs 16:18, it says, pride leads to destruction, and arrogance will lead to a fall. So if arrogance, pride, self-obsession leads to a fall, we want to think about what is the alternative way, right? Acknowledging God humbly, knowing that God will honor who he wants to. For example, Jesus. Jesus came to earth, right? In heaven, everybody knew who Jesus was. All of the angels glorified him. He was on the throne. Everyone recognized his divinity. When Jesus came to earth, people here didn't recognize that he is God, right? He had to give all of that up while he came to earth, right? In heaven, he was being worshipped as he should be, but he came to earth not to receive that worship, but to serve us, right? And we all know the ending. He died for us. The King of all died for us. It's really, really amazing, right? And he showed us that path of humility, not demanding that recognition, not demanding that he be recognized as someone. It's such a contrast to what we see with Haman. Jesus gave up his rights and humbly sacrificed himself. And so everything that we receive, we can recognize that it's what we want is from the King. What we want is from God, not from the world. We seek the approval of the eternal King, not the approval from worldly things. And we recognize our identity is rooted in God, not rooted in anything here on earth. When we speak of our identity, we're talking about how we think of ourselves, who we are, and how we view our own worth. And it all has to do with that we are worth what God thinks of us, and he sees us as very worthy, as very important. So God views Jesus as highly worthy. God glorifies Jesus, and glorifying means a high opinion. So God viewed Jesus as with a very high opinion, and then when Jesus died on the cross, he gave that to us. So now when God looks at us, he sees us through that lens and values us as deeply as he values Jesus. When we understand how God views us, it changes how we view ourselves and where our identity is rooted. And that brings change to our lives as well. I think back to when I was maybe 22, 23 years old. I was still learning about Jesus, trying to find my way, figuring out what does it mean to be a Christian? Does that mean I'm just, don't do anything wrong ever? And one day I was reading the Bible, and it said that God values us in such a way that Jesus died on the cross for us. And I had known that Jesus died on the cross for us, but there was a verse that just struck me that day, that there is no greater love than a man would die for his friends. And it struck me because I have friends that I care about. I love my friends. And it made sense to me that, right, those I love, I would die for them. Right? I would die for them because I love them. And to think of Jesus in that way, Jesus died for all of us because he sees us as friends. He calls us his friend. And that intimacy, that depth of relationship, of friendship, changed my life, realizing that relationship that he has with us changed my understanding of who I am. And so my identity became rooted in him. So you know this line from the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done. I want to invite us to think about that and think about how we can play a part in his kingdom coming here. How we can be a part of recognizing his will and engaging in his will being done here. Seeing our own will and choosing to set that aside, choosing to set our way, our path aside, and choosing his will instead. Take some time to think about what we can do to be a part of that, to be focused on his will instead of our own. And the third thing, find someone, ask someone to help you see the dots and connect the dots. We need people to help us connect those dots. Sometimes we're just in the grip of life, right? We're overcome with busyness, or if we're frustrated or struggling, we can kind of be blind to what God is doing. So we can reach out to those in our church or our friends to ask them to help us see those dots that are being connected in our lives. So in summary, think over those things that I've just shared. Setting aside pride, focusing on the path of humility like Jesus did. Amen? Whitney, do we have a closing song? Okay.